So today what we're going to make is it's a mitered placemat, but it's like self-mitering, so there's no binding. So it looks like it's bound, but it's not. So this is what we're doing right here, is this placemat. So these are really fun because you can take a really fun piece of fabric and put it in the middle. And then the border on the outside is the fabric that's on the back, and it's pulled to the front, and then you miter the corners as you're stitching it all together. This is a Karen Montgomery pattern, which means the pictures are great, the directions are clear and concise and to the point. I love that about her pattern. Today's a twofer because I'm going to show you how to make the placemat, and then I'm also going to show you how to make the matching napkins. Then what we did was we made a bundle where in the bundle you will get all of the stuff to make 4 placemats and 4 matching napkins. And I'm going to show you what tools go with that. Now, in the meantime, I'm not going to give you all of the measurements and whatnot because that's all part of the pattern. And as I have mentioned before, I'm a huge fan of copyright law, and I'm not going to give you Karen's pattern because it's Karen's pattern and she wrote it. So it's only $2.50. However, I'm going to show you some tips and tricks and some steps on the pattern. Karen also designed a ruler that is good for like everything. It's one of my favorite rulers. I use it all the time. That does lots of different things, but it's going to do dual duty in this demo. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the placemat. The first thing you're going to need to do, and like I said, all of this stuff's going to be in the kit to make 4 placemats, 4 matching napkins. So the first thing I did was I took a piece of fabric. I have already quilted most of this, but we're going to talk about some tips and tricks with the quilting first. In your kit, you're going to get the placemats as well as fusible fleece and muslin, so you can pre-quilt this section. If you have a machine that the feed dogs work really well, like mine, the feed dogs work really good, so I don't need to put the muslin underneath, but you can. If you want to have 1, that extra layer of stability, and 2, if you feed dogs catch on things, then you're going to want to put a piece of muslin down, and we're going to talk about some tips on that too. So what I've done is I have a piece of fabric. I fused a piece of single-sided fusible fleece on the back. Some tips with fusible fleece. If you lay this on the back of your fabric and then you press it till it sticks and you flip it to the other side and then press it again so that the glue melts, it'll be all sticky, but it'll be a little bumpy. So steam it after you have stuck down the glue on the fusible fleece. So what I've already done with this, I love a friction ruler for this kind of project. I took my longer ruler here, and I just did a 2-inch grid, a 2-inch cross-hatched grid. This is a little busy, so you can't really see it, but you can see on the back that I did a 2-inch grid. If you take your ruler and you find your 45-degree line and you line it up with the edge of your fabric, and you just take your friction pen and you mark a line. Shoop. And then you take the line on the 2-inch and set it on top of that line you just marked, and you mark it again, and you do that all the way across the fabric, and then you turn it the other way. So now you're going to turn it the sideways, and you line up your 45 again, and you make a line. And then you put it on the 2-inch and you make a line, and then you just keep moving this over. You make a line every 2 inches in both directions. I like cross hatching more than gridding because you get this sort of angled thing, because guess what? It doesn't matter if it's perfectly straight over here. You just want to get it straight next to each other. Okay, so that's how I marked my grid lines. If you have a darker piece of fabric or you have something that the friction pen might show up on later, you can use a chalk marker. I also really enjoy a chalk marker. If you have a walking foot on your machine, sometimes that's helpful. For the sake of this demo, I am simply going to use my regular open-toed foot so I can see. So you can see where I've already stitched all my grid down. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to start over here on this last line that needs to be sewn. And I'm going to line up that line right there in the middle of my foot with the line that I've marked on my fabric. I know I picked a busy fabric, so you can't see the line as well as you probably should. I did not think about that. We're just going to stitch along this line. Now, here's the thing, and this is why this is great for kids. If you'll notice, I'm intentionally not hitting that line perfectly, because when I go and iron that and the pen goes away, you're never gonna see it. You're never gonna know that I didn't hit that line just right, okay? I'm gonna take and turn it back around, and I'm gonna stitch the other direction. So now, these are just the last 2 lines I have to quilt, okay? Now, literally, I spent maybe 5 minutes quilting this before the video. It doesn't take that long, and it doesn't need to be perfect. If the person that you're sewing with wants to draw catfish, go for it. You just want to quilt this enough that it holds together. It doesn't have to be quilted to death. You just want enough quilting that it holds it together, okay? Now, I'm going to take this to my iron, and I'm going to iron away my friction marks. Doesn't take long. You just have to hit it with a little bit of, so friction pens come off with friction. That's why they will erase off of paper using the thing that looks like an eraser on the end of the pen, but it's not actually an eraser. So friction is energy, so the energy that comes off of the iron will also remove this ink. That being said, friction pens were not designed for fabric. And yes, they will come back sometimes, especially if the fabric gets really, really cold. So if you live in Minnesota and you plan on throwing this in the trunk of your car, the pen marks might come back if it's below freezing. They'll wash out. So once you make all of this stuff and you have all of your ink is gone, and then you run it through the washing machine, which you're probably going to do with a placemat, the ink will wash out. So you don't have to worry, you don't have to worry that much about it. Plus, you're going to stitch over these lines. So there, now my iron's hot. See how all those pen marks went away? And you can't see that this line wasn't perfectly straight because overall it just looks like it's quilted, okay? So now we have our piece quilted. I'm gonna simply trim it down to the size I know it needs to be. Let me get rid of this mess that I was playing with here. We are gonna cut this down to size. I'm gonna make myself have to do math here, and I don't want to do math. Sorry. So we're gonna try that the pattern calls for, and it's already quilted, so it's gonna trim really easy. Here's another reason that I like doing those pieces on the cross grain, because when you trim this down, you're not really losing anything. You're not losing any of the, the integrity of the design because it's all on the diagonal. So the pattern gives you plenty of extra space for the trimming. So if you're worried about the quilting being perfect on the edges or shrinking up or any of that, don't worry too much, because the pattern does give you plenty of extra space, and the kit is going to give you enough to have extra space. Okay? So now what I have is just a fat quarter piece of fabric. I'm going to take and lay this in the center of my piece of fabric. Now, I like 505 spray for temporary setting. You don't need to spray this to death. I always say 505 spray, but not like 80s hairspray, okay? You don't want your hair to be wet when you spray this on, so you don't want your fabric to be wet either. I'm literally just going to spray enough on there that it will stick down. Plus, I don't want overspray on my ironing board and on my cutting mat and all that. It's just enough that this is going to stay where I put it so I can trim it next, okay? We're going to trim our borders to the size we need them to be. Also, piece of cake. And since we have cut it down, then you don't have to worry about turning this. You don't have to worry about it just picking up and moving, and you can, you can cut with your right hand all the way around. That 505 spray is just enough to keep it where you want it to be so you can cut all of the sides. None of this is super hard yet. If any of these steps seem a little crazy, then ask. Right now, so far the hardest thing we've done is draw diagonal lines. Now, we've trimmed down our border to where we need it to be. Piece of cake, right? Now we're going to use the quick trim ruler. I love this ruler. This ruler is one of those rulers that just does all the things. I chose this fabric because it was dark for a reason. One of the things that Karen's put on this ruler is there's two places where the 45 angle meet. They meet at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and they meet over here at 1.5 inches, or no, it's 1 inch seam allowance, okay? We are going to use this one here where there's two white angles, two white lines that make a 90-degree angle, right? If we take that ruler and we line it up right on the corner of this placemat, okay? So here's my 45 and here's my 45. And I can see this seam allowance right here. See how they intersect on that 1/4 inch line right there? This is what we want to happen. We're going to take our cutter and just trim that corner away. And now what we've done is we've given ourselves a 1/4 inch seam allowance from this point to here. This will all be a piece of cake when we get there. This ruler is really great for when you're doing flippy corners and stuff too, because you get a perfect seam allowance without having to do any like really weird math or, you know, no trig involved. If you just line up those two lines, you're going to be right where you want to be. If you're doing the brown bag mystery quilt right now, this is the ruler that Karen used to demo doing square and a square points on Saturday's video. Okay, so now we have the beginnings of a placemat. Aren't we cool? Then we're going to flip this over to the back and see how, because we put that 505 spray on, everything lays really nice and flat. I'm going to use my white pen now because my fabric is so dark. Remember last week I told you that this is the pen that freaks everybody out because they think it doesn't work? Because you got to let it kind of dry before you can see it. I'm going to still use my 1/4 trim ruler or my quick trim ruler and my white pen just because my fabric is dark. And I'm going to mark 1/2 inch from the end of all 4 sides of my placemat. Now this is on the back. Not a 1/4 inch, but 1/2 inch. You know, I always say that quilting is my favorite because it's like creative math. And all of these little measurements make up for better success in the end. Okay. All right, so we've got our 1/2 inch marked on both sides. Now we're going to take this over to our ironing board. And we're going to fold this back to where we can see that line. This line is not going to show when you're done, so don't freak too much about where it, you know, where you can see it, but you do want to use your iron and press it right there at that 1/2 inch point. Okay? So what I typically do is I will kind of start on one end and get it straight for, you know, 3 or 4 inches where I can really see that whole space, and then iron it. And then I'll roll the section over a little bit as I go so that I can see the line is on the edge all the way to the end. Remember that when we are quilting, we press, we don't iron. So you want to take your iron and just let the weight of your iron press this crease. And I'm not going back and forth. I'm just moving my iron as I move my fabric so that I get a really solid crease there. Okay? And you want these edges to be crisp. So what I typically will do is press this part all the way across, and then when I'm done with it, I will hit it with steam. Because I really want the edge of this to be really crisp. So I'm going to iron all 4 pieces. Sorry, Steve. If you didn't want a facial, you're getting one anyway.
What's wrong with going back and forth?
It distorts the fabric. It makes it stretch. It's not like pressing a shirt. You want to have your seams lay really, really flat. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this back over to my machine, and I want to stitch a 1/4 inch from the edge of my quilted surface. So, however you get there, I happen to get there with a 1/4 inch piecing foot. That's my favorite way of getting to a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to put my 1/4 inch piecing foot on. Easy enough. And then I'm just going to use my 1/4" foot as my guide to stitch around here. Now my machine has a tie-off stitch, which is really sexy in this stage because I don't have a really messy tie-off, you know, back and forth movement. So I'm going to just follow the edge of my quilted piece with my 1/4" piecing foot. Now, as an extra little bonus, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but on your 1/4" foot, you see that little line right there? Right there in that little crack? That line is 1/4" from your needle. So if you stitch to where that 1/4" lines up with the edge of your fabric, and then you turn it, you're going to have a 1/4" seam allowance as you go around the corner. Okay? So we're just going to zoom along this real quick. And again, there's a line from the edge of my foot. I'm going to stop right and turn it. I always talk about how much I love my pivot feature. This is another reason I love the pivot feature on these machines, because I don't have to pick my needle up and put it back down again. It just stays where I want it. And since we glued this down, everything's going to stay where it needs to stay, and I don't have to worry about turning this fabric around. And when I get back to where I started, I'm going to do a tie-off stitch again and cut my thread. Now, this is pretty much the end of the project until we get to the mitering point. I'm going to take my fabric and I'm going to fold this in a 45-degree angle. Okay, so I'm just going to line these 2 points up. You should have the point of your quilting, your quilted piece should point straight up on the side. I'm then going to do a 1/4" seam allowance, because remember we cut our fabric to have a 1/4" fabric allowance. See how this is not really straight? We want this to be straight. So if you line these 2 sides up, you line up the piece you're going to sew, but then as a second reference, you line this side up, you're going to get a really straight angle. Okay? So I'm just going to set this down here. I want to get right there in that corner piece. And I'm going to stitch along these 4 corners. And I'm going to do that on all 4 pieces. I thought about doing this step ahead of time, but it's kind of hard to do that, so I didn't. Now, since we've already sewn that other side, this part isn't, you're not going to have that reference all the way across. But if you lay this as flat as you can get it on this side, so everything lines up here and everything lines up here. And if you get all 4 corners put together, it's a little like making fitted sheets on a bed. You want the sides to fit what you're making. Sorry, Steve.
No, you're fine.
And you can do this technique with bigger projects, so a table runner, or you could do this technique with a quilt. I have not typically had great results with doing it on a quilt because the quilt is just so big. But a small, like a baby quilt or a wall hanging, this is a really nice way to face a wall hanging, especially if you have a really pretty fabric that you want to make as part of the feature on the front of your quilt. You can do this technique. See, this is why we want the edges really crispy when we press them, so that they line up really straight. Okay, so we've sewn all 4 corners. This is where I like using a point turner also, so you can really poke these corners out. You're going to flip them so the back fabric comes to the front. Okay, so we're almost done already. Let me grab my point turner real quick. Take and point your corners in really sharp. You want to have a really nice square point there. If you do that on all 4 corners as well. Now, as an extra little step, what I'll do now is I will go and press this down. Just because I want to make sure that everything is laying where I want it to be. I'm a big fan of making the iron do my heavy lifting for me, because the weight of the iron and the science behind the way steam works really makes everything easier with quilting. If you let the steam do what it's meant to do, everything's going to go where you want it to be. Yeah, it's a really cool technique. It really is. And if you need to make a quick gift, like, this is why I don't say it's just a kid's project. It's just something that's easy to do with kids. But if you got to go to somebody's house for dinner and you want to take a quick hostess gift, yeah, that's really cool. It's a piece of cake. Then I'm going to make it even easier for you. If you're freaked out about taking this over to your iron and top stitching it so that you don't get it perfectly even, remember on a couple of different videos I have talked about the Stitch Perfect tape. I love this stuff. So I will simply pull off the amount that I need to get from here to here. It doesn't rip very well. And I'll tuck it up underneath here. You don't have to iron this tape on. This is just sticky tape. But the beauty of this tape is that when you wash it, it comes out. So you don't end up with something really chunky and thick. Actually, it just sticks the 2 pieces of fabric together, and then you can stitch right through it. And it never fails when I try to show this to people. It doesn't want to come apart.
Peeling that paper off.
Well, usually what I do is I fold the paper back before I put it on there. You know, like when you fold Scotch tape back so you can find the end? I do that before I stick it underneath. So see how it's kind of like a foamy tape? When you set this back down over the top of it, you can just press it down, and you don't have to iron it to make it sticky, because it's not meant to be permanent. It's just meant to put your fabric to get down, and then you can reposition it. Okay, so I'm just going to do 1 corner for time's sake so we can show you how to stitch it. And again, I'm going to take and line this up just underneath where my other piece is. This is a 1/2 inch wide tape, which I would recommend, especially if you're working with kids, because if you don't get it perfectly straight, it washes away when it's done. So if the tape is sticking out over the end, it doesn't really matter, because it's going to wash out. So if you don't stick it all the way down, this is what I just said I was going to do this, and then I didn't. If you pull the paper away from it before you stick it down to the fabric, it's easier to get it off of there. So I will usually pull 1 section back before I stick it underneath. Then the tape comes off really simply. Okay, so we're going to push this up under there, and we're just going to stick our fabric down. Now, we've talked about top stitching before in the past. We're going to talk about it again. If you'll notice, when we stitched our top down, we have this really pretty 1/4 inch seam all the way around the back. So if we take our stitch in the ditch foot, change out our 1/4 inch and put on our stitch in the ditch foot, this is my favorite top stitching foot. So I will take my needle and move it over. I'm bouncing my needle over to about 25 millimeters. You can put it wherever you like. We are simply going to top stitch the edge of our quilt or our placemat. Okay, so if you take your stitch in the ditch foot and you line it up with the edge of the piece that you folded over, now you can do that tie off stitch again, and it makes a little knot, and then we're just going to use our stitch in the ditch foot and top stitch the edge of this placemat. Now, once you get to this point where you have top stitched it, technically you're done. You can end here. But if you want to get all fancy about it, now again, here's where our pivot feature is really, really nice, because we can get right up here to the corner and turn it and go around. okay? And we're just going to top stitch all the way around our placemat. So this is what you end up with, is you have, I need to trim these threads off right there, but you have really perfect top stitch. So now if you want to get really fancy and you want to write your name on it, or you want to do a decorative stitch up here, you could pick any of the decorative stitches in your machine. So say we wanted to stitch this on there, we could stitch that around as a secondary border. You could top stitch some ribbon on. You could stitch some buttons on there. You could do anything you wanted to anywhere in this placemat. Okay, so now you have a quilted placemat. Now, the second part of this demo is to make matching napkins. The same ruler that we did our fancy 1/4 inch seam allowance with also cuts perfect circles. So the pattern has you cut, I don't remember what size it is, but for the sake of today's demo, we're going to cut a, well, it's a napkin, so we want to make it big enough. I think it's an 18 inch napkin. So we have the center of our square marked right here. This is just a fat quarter. This is the middle of our block. This ruler has not only a bunch of really cool markings on it, but it also has holes in it. See the holes? If you line, depending on what line or what hole you line these up in, that's how you use it to cut circles. I've used this to cut all kinds of circles. You can tell that this is usually the size circle I cut because there's a pen mark there. If I take, and here's the other fancy thing, you can cut it down to 1/8 of an inch size differences because you have these tiny little pivot points. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of my pivot points. I like these magic pins because I can really hold the top of it. And I'm going to stick that in the pivot point hole. See? And then I'm going to use this just to hold it still. Now, I want to cut, let's say, I'm going to cut, what's 8 times 2? A 6-inch circle. This is started, I guess I could do math better. This is started on the 1/2 inch line. So if I take my pen and put it in the 8.5 inch line, 8 minus a half, or 8.5 minus a half is 8, and 8 times 2 is 16, is going to give me a 16-inch circle. So it's a little like, you know, your 7th grade geometry class and your protractors. Oh, there's a crack in that right there. And we're just going to take this and make a circle. So there's no looking around your house for the exact size plate that you want and folding it in 4s and all of that nonsense. We're not doing any of that. Here's my circle. So then I'm just going to take and put a couple of pins in. And, oh, I don't have any of my good scissors, so I'll use my paper scissors. And I'm just going to cut this circle out. Okay? But if I do it like this instead of cutting the circle out, let me show you a hot tip. If I put a couple of pins in, my 2 pieces of fabric are right sides together, right? So instead of taking this over to the sewing machine and it wiggling and whatever, I've got my circle pinned together. So I'm just going to take this over to my machine. I'm going to change my foot again because I want to be able to see what I'm doing. So I'm going to put that clear foot back on, my J foot. See how easy it is to change these feet? And I'm just going to sew right on that line. Now the pattern has you cut this in half. What the pattern actually has you do is cut the two and then sew them together and turn them, which is fine. You can do it like that. But since we've sewn along that circle along the line, now we can just cut this out with a seam allowance around it. So, and it doesn't have to be perfect. You could do this with pinking shears if you're worried about it fraying. But everything's going to be around on the inside, so it's not that big a deal. Okay. I really love how easy this ruler makes marking a circle. This doesn't have to be beautiful. Nobody's going to see it. All right, so now we have our circle. Since this is actually supposed to be a half circle, we're going to take and cut it in half. Because the napkin that you're making actually looks like a little tree when you fold it. So it's actually a half a circle. But you want two different fabrics so that it looks like a fancy tree. So since we've already sewn our circle, we're gonna do the turning part after the fact. This makes this part just a bit easier. So now I have two, and I'm gonna sew from here, and I'm gonna stop, and then I'm gonna sew from here to here, okay? So that I can get that extra piece. I wanna be able to turn it. Now we kind of need that 1/4 inch seam allowance, but a straight line is a whole lot easier to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance than a circle. Okay, so I'm going to sew about, I don't know, 3 or 4 inches, pick it up and move about 3 inches over, and then finish sewing my circle together. Now, this is the other point where my point turner comes in really handy. So we're going to turn the circle right way out. I like having a big enough because I hate turning things right way out. But this is super easy. Now, the reason I like this point turner for this project, I have 2 point turners I like, but the reason I like this one for this project is because it's pointy on one end and it's round on the other end. So if I take my pointy end and I poke the corners out, I have a really sharp point on both of the points. So if we poke those out, they look, you know, really clean. But then if I take the curved end and run it along the inside of my circle, I can just push the rest of that bit out with my the curved end of my point turner. So see if I run it underneath there, see how it just pushes that all the way out, all the way around? That makes it a whole lot easier to press. So when I press this down, all my seams are going to line up because all of that extra fabric has already been pushed to the outside. Okay? And then I'm going to press, if I press my circle first and then come back and press the straight part, look at what happens. If you press the part that's already been stitched down, the other part that's open just kind of falls into place. And now it all looks straight. Okay? So now I'm going to take that top stitch foot and I'm just going to stitch all the way around my napkin. Okay? Now, here's where the secret comes in. There's a special secret folding piece in there that comes in the pattern, where that's why you want them to be two-tonal, because then you can have fun with your folding tricks for your next fancy dinner. See? All right, that's what I have. That's my demo.